Hello everyone. Today I am going to take a seminar about disaster risk reduction, and the major purpose of this lesson is to introduce and orient aims, concepts, formulas, process and approaches of disaster risk reduction. And this presentation has been made a relationship between disaster risk reduction and sustainable development goals and the guiding principle in implementing disaster risk reduction strategies. On completion of this lesson, is going to illustrate various strategies in disaster risk reduction, orient and implementation related activities on disaster risk reduction at micro and macro level. It gives and making a relationship between disaster risk reduction and sustainable development goals for sustainable developments. It driving guides principles of disaster risk reduction strategies. Now let us look in the meaning of disaster. Disaster is nothing but it means an occurrence causing widespread distractions and distress in the land surface. At present, the disaster risks are gradually increasing worldwide. Mostly disasters are related to nature and climatic conditions. Those are floods, landsliding, cyclones, wildfire, and storms. Also, most of the living people and livestock, fertile lands, and environmental conditions are affected by the above mentioned disasters in development countries. And the development attained 80% of the economic losses due to the disaster events and incidents. And the poor countries or the developing countries facing the vulnerabilities in variable hazards due to low capacity of the communities and the system in risk reduction measures. Moreover, the development efforts are increasingly at risk. Lack of proper urban planning, poor urban governance, and also land management, vulnerable rural livelihoods, and declining ecosystems, life patterns of the communities, new scientific inventions, and climate changes are evidence based on expansion of risk in India. The Disaster Management Act in 2005 provides policy framework for dealing with vulnerability, natural hazards, and threats. It based on this act, all the states and union territories have developed disaster management plans according to the geographical area and disaster risks. Moreover, under the guidance of Disaster Management Act, all the district have established community-based disaster preparedness plan to mitigate and prevention of natural disasters. And what is mean by disaster risk reduction? Is nothing but disaster risk reduction is a systematic and scientific approach for identifying, assessing, and reducing the risk of disaster in particular areas. It also explains applications of policies, strategies, and practices that minimize hazards, vulnerabilities, and disaster risk throughout a society, and aims and concepts of the disaster risk reduction. The aim of disaster risk reduction is to diminish socio-economic vulnerabilities to disaster and dealing with the environmental hazards and the threats, and and the ex- and the example of disaster risk reduction are reducing exposure and hazard threats, diminishing vulnerability of people, and sustaining natural resources, environment and management, improving of the community, and establishing early warning systems. And this is the example for early warning systems. And also early warning system, it is related to earthquakes, floods, drought, and cyclone. And now let us look at the process of disaster risk reduction. It begins with prevention and mitigation, followed by preparedness and prediction, warning and evacuation, adaptation, emergency response, recovery, monitoring. First, we are going to look at prevention and mitigation. Prevention and mitigation plans reduces the risk of the disaster and minimize the loss of human beings and resources in the disaster prone areas. It also plan ensures the sustainable results in vulnerable mapping areas and the community and target people involvement is needed in prevention process. Mitigation is an effective activity to reduce the ill effects of disasters and continue with preparedness. It preparedness aims to reduce the risk in the location of disaster risk areas and to involve in communication information and warning systems also. It planning is aimed to establish a capacity to respond situations that affect a country or region by putting in place preparedness measures. Continue with prediction, warning, and evacuation. Disaster brings great damages, destruction, and devastation of human beings as well as natural resources. This process of prediction and warning system prevent economic loss and diminish damages in the community. Adaptation. Adaptation is nothing but the community has to follow adaptation process to accommodate their livelihood and crisis situation. Emergency response, it gives immediate response and assistance to the people who under hazardous situation and risk after disaster occur. The emergency response plans elicit risk assessments and scenarios of emergency. Finally, recovery decisions and actions are very important in the process of disaster risk reduction. And the disaster recovery is to enable process to follow set of actions, procedures to relieve from the risks and implementation process. Implementation contains three process: adaptation, emergency response, recovery. Adaptation, that is process to accommodate their livelihood and crisis situations. Emergency response, it gives immediate response and assistance to the people who under hazardous situations and risk after disaster occurs. Recovery, it's nothing but an action supports to restore and resilience of the affected communities. And now we are going to look at approaches for disaster risk reduction. Those are some political, technical, and socio educational approaches are there. Disaster seriously disturbs human life, livelihoods, economic system, and political scenarios in the society. It is based on the experience and learning. We try to understand the fivefold approaches in disaster risk reduction. First one is political approach. Political approach creates political will in prevention of disaster risk and welfare of people after disaster events. And also it besides the political approach is path to reframe the national disaster policy to develop new policy based on the disaster prone areas. This approach ensures allocation of sufficient resources in prevention of disaster and recovery phase. Continued with the technical approach, this approach is pertaining science and technology, early warning devices systems that are developed through technical approach. This approach guides and facilitates in assessment of risk and hazardous, monitoring, mitigation process, identifying disaster prone areas through mapping, and also socio educational approach. This approach creates responsibilities and communities of the community in disaster risk reduction, and the socio educational approach imparts community based education and disaster prone areas, creating awareness, skill development for safety and resilience of the community. And the guiding And the guiding principles of disaster risk reduction strategies are few. This suggests few guiding principles for effective implementation of disaster risk reduction strategies at national context. Those are identification, that is, identifying vulnerable groups and areas through mapping, formation, that is, forming various communities in the process of disaster management, continued with capacity building, that is, strengthening various stakeholders and community through comprehensive training programs. And planning. Planning is that preparing clear blueprint on need assessment objectives, program planning, intervention strategies, resources, and time period. Implementation is taking actions and implementing programs based on disaster implications. Intervention, that is doing timely interventions based on the community and area context. This is the example for early warning system, and it's a diagrammatical representation of disaster risk reduction. Just look for this. And finally, the summary of this seminar is disaster risk reduction strategies are to find the meaningful way to reduce the risk at maximum level. And the community based risk reduction is very relevant to Indian context, and it had numerous associated activities during the implementation at micro and macro levels. And the guiding principles lead to understand the disaster risk reduction strategies at all level. For more information, visit this website and learn about this topic. Thank you so much.